Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really thrilled to have this speaker here with us today. It's Brigadier General Gail Crawford. I think this is the first time, General Crawford, I actually addressed you as Brigadier General Gail Crawford. And before we get started, you really have a interesting journey to where you're sitting now with the stars on your uniform. I'd wonder if you could share some of that with us before we start getting into some of the substance. How did you
yes, sir,
join the Air Force?
Well, sir, my journey to become an airman has sort of a spurious beginning. I come from a family of service members. My older siblings, joined the military, and I went off to play basketball for Albany State College right out of high school. And as it was, perhaps I wasn't quite ready to be a collegiate athlete, and was feeling a little despondent, didn't know what I was going to do with my life. Ran into one of my classmates from high school who told me that he had joined the Air Force, and he told me about the GI Bill and traveling and seeing the world. And I was so excited that I went straight to the recruiter's office at the mall that day and signed up to become an airman. And so off I went as Airman Basic Crawford to join the military some 3 decades ago. And that's kind of how it started. My career has been, I would say, peppered with amazing mentors, like every step of the way. Yourself, sir, certainly included. Those times where I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do next, there was always someone there waiting in the wings to guide my steps, much like you did, sir. And I remember thinking once I was a paralegal, actually, and I had a mentor, a staff sergeant, who thought that I could, really do well at being a paralegal, and helped me to figure out how to get there. I got there, I became a paralegal, and I had judge advocates who were supervisors who were kind enough to give me time to go to school at night or on the weekends, obviously after I had done my work. But mentors who helped me along the way. I was fortunate enough to work at America's First Command, Air Combat Command, with then Brigadier General Charlie Dunlap, who encouraged me to be my best self, to continue to work hard and pursue excellence, and gave me opportunities to do that. Nurtured me when I stumbled. And so that's a long way around the bend to say I've been very, very lucky. Some would call it blessed, sir.
I think we want to return to some more of that later on in the presentation, but let me just say for the record, you were the one that kept me from the only negative, and what General Crawford is referring to is at that time she was my executive officer, which meant she was my right-hand person. And the only negative about that is we both sort of got agitated about the same sort of things. Anyway, General Crawford, what's on everybody's mind, of course, is what's going on in Ukraine. And is there anything you can share with us about how your organization, the JAGs or the Air Force or whatever, are reacting to it or dealing with it?
Yes, sir. Obviously, one of the things that our chief of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force have been focused on since they took office is this sort of return to strategic power competition. Our secretary once said in a briefing, if it doesn't involve Russia or China, don't even ask me if we could do it. We're not going to fund it. We're not going to prioritize it. And so we've kind of had our eyes primarily on China, but also on Russia and some Russian aggression. And so, of course, some of the things that we had tried to negotiate against and hope against and plan against have happened with this recent Russian aggression. You would be proud to know, sir, that there are certainly judge advocates who have deployed to the EUCOM theater of operations in support of what's going on in the world right now. Sometimes it seems a little esoteric, like what are the lawyers really doing in a combat operation? And it depends. We are sending folks to do everything from, sometimes some acquisition type stuff to make sure we have the necessary equipping that we need, the logistics.
It looks like General Crawford's Zoom might have been gotten a little frozen there. We'll hope to get her back here in a minute.
Sure, we do what we can do to keep the world safe. Yes, sir.
Yeah, General Crawford, you froze up there for a minute shortly after you started talking about EUCOM, which for our audience, she's referring to U.S. European Command, which is how the military kind of organizes itself on the joint level. And let's talk about, let's talk about that a little bit more. So you were talking about the different kinds of things that judge advocates do in the operational realm, broadly speaking, when they deploy. And it's interesting because we're going to have General Spencer on tomorrow, and he's literally written the book on, he has a book called Green Eye Shades, which he wrote before his current book, where he talks about exactly that, the fiscal law aspects. And along that line, if you could give us, one of the questions we have actually from one of our students is, you're managing this large organization, or you're leading this large organization, and how do you do it? I mean, how is it organized, and what are the kinds of things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis to address the national security issues that we're embedded with these days?
Yes, sir, and that's a great question. As you know, sir, any leadership job, there are some that you are fortunate enough to be entrusted with. One of the first things you learn is that you can't do it all. You can't do it all, and so I am fortunate to be surrounded by a team of amazing experts who are specializing in different areas of the law, and we can certainly talk about those. I do have a few slides available to pop through those, to just talk about some of the portfolios that we have that my experts are working on, those nearly 100 judge advocates. We have folks who are specializing in cyber, in space. I have international law attorneys. I also have some coalition partners that work with us from Australia and the UK, working on that international law portfolio. I have what we call, what you would consider the law of operations, law of war experts. Many people are certainly interested in the space law portfolio, as that's something that's clearly an emerging area of the law. But really, we rely on the expertise of many judge advocates. That's how we do it, and delegation is certainly important for our leadership teams to allow that flexibility, so that if I have a smart and capable team of folks, which I do, handling some of the subject matter expert stuff, that frees me up to do some of the higher level engagement with our chiefs of the Space Force and the Air Force, with the Secretary and senior leaders in industry. And so it certainly does help to have, experts, surround yourself with experts, and delegation to do that. Issues involving senior leaders, in our Air Force, obviously get elevated to my level. And so I would be the one doing those senior leader engagements. But for the most part, the way that I do it is that I have a team of amazing folks, and I just get out of their way, quite frankly, and let them do what they do.
Let's take a look at a few of those slides, and so we can get this bigger picture of the kinds of issues that are current today in the Air Force, especially for the uniform side. So
Okay. I'm not sure if I can push the slides or if Amanda can help us out with those.
Yeah, I think you can just,
You can share your screen if you would like. If not, I can share mine, whatever is best
Yes,
for you.
if you don't mind, if you can share your screen, that would help me out. Thank you so much.
Of course. Just one moment here.
while we're bringing that up, one of the questions we got from Logan Myrick, who is a very unusual judge advocate in the field. He went to Duke in a sense that he took his classes here at Duke, but he went to North Carolina Central University, and he's now at PSAB in Saudi Arabia. And as soon as we get done with this, I'd like to return to it, because he's asking about what is your vision of the kinds of things operations law will be doing in 5, 10, 15 years. And I think space is one of those things, but I'll let you answer that question since you were the one who was asked. Maybe we can take a look at the slides there, because I think they're being shared. Can you see that?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I can see them, and we've kind of stepped through some of the preliminary stuff. But if we could go to the next slide, I always want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about who we are as American airmen, as a JAG Corps, so that first slide is just sort of a smattering of what we look like. I'll talk a little bit about what we do. The Judge Advocate General's Corps serves both the Air Force and the Space Force. There is no Space Force JAG Corps.
Yeah, can I jump in there?
Yeah, sure.
A question about that.
Sure.
Are you anticipating and looking out 5, 10, 15 years, a separate Air Force Space Force JAG, or with that they wear a different emblem or something?
So probably not in the very near term, but I suspect down the road, as the Space Force is sort of growing, it's its own separate service now. It's pretty small. But as it gets bigger, as it sort of grows into its own, I anticipate that down the road there will be a separate JAG Corps for the Space Force. But for now, there's only one Judge Advocate General for the Department of the Air Force, and he serves the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, as well as the Chief Space Officer for the Space Force. And so we do both. And so as Judge Advocates, on our uniforms, we wear both patches because we are the JAG Corps to both for now, but certainly stay tuned for that. Can you go ahead and go to the next slide, Amanda? I'm sorry, sir, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, how do you manage those JAGs that are in Space Force? Are they pretty much going to stay in Space Force? Will they go to other assignments, or is that a TBD?
Yes, sir. So there are no JAGs inside the Space Force. All of the JAGs are in the Air Force, and they have assignments to the Space Force. And so because they belong to the Air Force, they can certainly move in and out of those Space Force billets. So folks who are serving the Space Force at different space garrisons or their installations right now can certainly move freely between Air Force and Space Force bases. There are certain career fields who are actually in the Space Force, like some of those those space launch operators, if you remember, those guys are all going to the Space Force because that capability will no longer reside inside of the Air Force or in the other services. And so I'll talk a little bit later about why a separate service and what we've done, what the Department of the Air Force has done to pull those resources under the control of the United States Space Force.
Well, great. Let's see what you do here, according to the slide. Looks like we're having a little bit of challenge with General Crawford's Zoom there.
That with the Secretary of Defense and the Department of the Air Force priorities, and you see those symbols for the Air Force and the Space Force depicted on the left. And then in the middle, that overlay of that blue, green, and red, those represent the different domains, legal domains, where we practice law in our entire national security law practice for the Air Force. Because I grew up in the Charlie Dunlap School of PowerPoint, I don't want you to think, sir, that I completely forgot everything I learned. Amanda, if you can go to the next slide. I will tell you that that red arrow is where I practice. And I know, go back one, please. The red arrow that's pointing there at the blue operations and international law domain is where I practice. And so that's about the extent of how much PowerPoint wizardry I've achieved, sir. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Amanda. You know, those things go away, sir, if you don't practice, right? So what does it mean? What does it mean that, you know, we are practicing national security law under the strategic framework of the national security strategy, the national defense strategy? Essentially what that means is, as you see here on the slide, we primarily provide full spectrum legal advice to the Department of the Air Force from my office. Also, we provide support to other legal offices around the globe. We have airmen who represent the Air Force, you know, in that red domain, in courts, in civilian courts as well, in that green domain and other fora. And so that inform, engage, and partner is not just within the service, but it's also with agencies and partners, allies, and academia. And so the last part of that is what I believe is our highest intention, and that is to develop leaders for tomorrow so that our American way of life persists. If we go to the next slide, this kind of gets to a question that I was asked earlier about how we manage, you know, 100+ people on my bigger team in the operations and international law domain. I do it with these amazing leaders that are on this slide who have these areas of expertise in those different places or domains that are depicted on the slide. That's how we do it. We have, and these are fairly senior folks in the JAG Corps. Some of you who have been around for a while might recognize some of these faces. And so sometimes I just put the slide up just so you can see familiar faces. You know, there's Mr. Ed Monahan on the bottom right corner there, who I, you know, sort of tongue in cheek say that Mr. Monahan does really everything. I think Mr. Monahan has forgotten more about the law of operations than most of us will ever even know. And so I am truly fortunate to have this great team of leaders who are helping me to execute the mission of the United States Air Force and to help
Ed was really one of my mentors.
Yes, sir.
I remember
yes,
he was
sir.
down in the 9th Air Force, and looks like Jennifer up there, the Deputy Director of Space Law.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
so-
Jen Heiser. Yes, sir. Anthony Bell doing up our cyberspace. Pat Wells is doing Air and International. Michelle Suberly is acting right now as my as my environmental law chief. We are going to get a new person in this summer, and Michelle has stepped up to do that. But I just wanted to put a face with that team that I was talking about that helps me to, you know, delegate, and they really are amazing. And so very fortunate to have all of them on the team.
Roughly how many lawyers, uniformed and civilian, are involved in the whole environmental law enterprise?
Wow, sir. Like I could hazard a guess. It would be off. I would say Wow, I would say hundreds. I would
Yeah,
say
that would have
hundreds.
been my thought as well, because it's an area that a lot of people don't even realize that is a big part of the Air Force JAG Corps legal practice.
Yes, sir. And more importantly, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, not only is it a part of our legal practice, but one of the things that the Air Force has done that's different from the other services is we have pulled environmental law into the operations law domain because it is really an acknowledgement of the impact that environmental law has on the strategic framework of how we do our practice of operations. Uh, Environmental law impacts everything from where we can train our pilots, where we can put our airframes, our weapon systems, um, even how are we going to keep the lights on to make sure that we have energy and utilities for our bases. And so environmental law has definitely become a really, really important portfolio for how we fight our nation's wars, how we train, how we organize, how we equip. And so we have taken a step towards operationalizing that so that our warfighters are talking to our environmental lawyers on the front end if they're thinking about introducing a new weapon system, if we're going to buy more aircraft, we're going to train different airframes in different places. We've got those environmental lawyers on the front end of that conversation so that when we are ready to move to operational capability, we don't have these snags that might delay how we accomplish our mission. And we have seen some amazing results in our ability to clear the way for our senior leaders to continue the path of modernizing our Air Force and accelerating change in how we do business. If we could go to the next slide, Amanda, just a few focus areas here that I will talk about. Probably none of these will be a surprise, and some of them we've already talked about. And so I'll kind of skip through those because I really want to make sure that we have an opportunity for more questions and more engagement. And so these are the areas that are really of considerable focus for me as I work to serve our nation. On everybody's mind, as General Dunlap says, is sort of this return to strategic power competition, the rise of China, Russian aggression is something that we are definitely facing every day. Our challenges are big as we think about the rise of China and Russia and the emerging threats that they pose, particularly in the space domain. Which has changed our calculation and what we need to do to defend access to space. I'll talk a little bit about some artificial intelligence and autonomous systems, which are some key enablers for the future. And we're working to leverage technology and AI and to maintain our military advantage. You'd mentioned environmental law, sir, so I will talk a little bit more about,
Well, General Crawford, if you can hear me, we're having a little bit of difficulty with your Zoom connection, but it looks like one of the things, if you can hear me, I think we're going to be interested in exploring more is your views on AI and autonomous and the department. Go ahead. Looks like we're back.
Yes, sir. I was hoping to move to the next slide. All right. So, scholars of war, like General Dunlap, who I call the original Air Force Sun Tzu, could probably.
A legend in his own mind, I can assure you.
But seriously, sir, you could probably give us all an exhaustive history and context on the law of war and how we organized and trained and equipped and outfitted ourselves to defend the homeland, to defend our nation, to fight our wars. But for the most part, most of the people probably here at this conference, most of the time that you've spent on this planet, we've spent a vast majority of that time in what we call the CENTCOM AOR, right? Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East. And so, to give a historical backdrop for this slide that I have showing here, I would like to read a quote from a piece called Accelerate, Change, or Lose. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a moving call to action, by our 22nd Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General C.Q. Brown, as he took office in August of 2020. And the quote begins, "Since Desert Storm, the United States Air Force has enjoyed a historically anomalous period of dominance, becoming an Air Force contributing to a joint force that is feared and envied around the world. Since the 1980s, we've grown accustomed to America's relative wealth, the ability of the taxpayer to fund the most exquisite capabilities, and time for our industry to deliver those capabilities. And we did this even while we executed nearly 30 years of continuous combat operations. For decades, American allies and partners, warfighters, have felt safe with the top cover and strategic deterrence our air forces have provided. And for much of our existence as a country, our homeland has served as a sanctuary. These assumptions no longer hold true. Competitors, especially China, have made and continue aggressive efforts to negate long-enduring U.S. warfighting advantages, and they challenge the United States' interests and geopolitical position. While the nation was focused on countering violent extremist organizations, our competitors were focused on defeating us. They have studied, resourced, and introduced systems specifically designed to defeat the United States Air Force capabilities that have underpinned the American way of war for a generation. Future warfare will not remain far from our shores. We must be prepared to address our competitors' attempt to hold the U.S. homeland at risk with unconventional, conventional, and even nuclear forces," end quote. Those are some sobering words from our Chief of Staff, and they lay the backdrop for this slide, and I'll explain. The picture on the left, no, please don't, next, stay on the same slide. The picture on the left is Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia in 1991. And this is an excellent depiction of what General Brown described as exquisite. It's a fairly robust and fixed main base. It has some robust facilities, communications, infrastructure. You can see the nice planes all laid out there, nice on the flight line. And it was safe with the top cover of strategic deterrence that our Air Force could provide. In other words, air power and air superiority was not in question. And so we could have installations like this laying out there. We believe that those days are fleeting. And so we are changing as an Air Force the way we organize, the way we train, the way we present forces for battle. Our main operating bases are going to have the ability to disperse and disaggregate into forward operating bases. And so what you see on that right side of that slide is you see a main operating base that will serve as a hub. And then you'll see the forward operating bases that we call spokes and contingency locations where we will have to be able to move out to those locations for resiliency, for continuity of operations. And so this is going to create some challenges for us because we're not necessarily trained or equipped to support this type of Air Force. But this is what we're going to have to do because this creates a more unpredictable, a more resilient, force, and it will also present the adversary with multiple dilemmas. We call this change agile combat employment. And as the warfighter is training and equipping and organizing to disaggregate and disperse, it's caused us as judge advocates to take a look at how we train and how we establish what General Dunlap used to call those expeditionary skills. In other words, what it is that you're going to need when you are in a forward deployed location. And what I will tell you is one of the things that we are having to go back to, sir, that you experienced way back in the early 90s, is that we're going to have to be able to do this disaggregation in a situation that's going to be degraded comms, right? We're not going to necessarily have reach back. And so, our JAGs are going to be more junior. They're going to have to be out there sooner, and they're going to have everything they need to be there, because they may not have the ability to reach back to more senior leaders like myself to ask a question. More importantly, our JAGs might not be there at all. And so we are looking at the way we're training ourselves and our warfighters to better prepare for the next fight. Yes, sir.
It almost sounds like a little bit of Back to the Future, because
yes, sir.
Back in the dawn of man, when we were first doing this, there was communication, but it wasn't reliable enough. So we used to bring things on CDs, and I guess
yes, sir.
About thumb drives and so forth. Are you thinking in those terms? I might remember we had the kits.
Yes, sir. The Jag in a box. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Jag in a box kits. And are you thinking about that for the future?
Yes, sir. We are thinking about how we can send folks forward as a full up round with everything that they need, and so that we have come to rely, like you said, on this exquisite communication systems that we didn't have necessarily back in the early 90s. And so we are certainly capitalizing on some of the lessons that we learned from the early 90s, sir, and a lot of the work that you did. We are going back to the future because we are anticipating degraded comms. And so we're going to have to go back to being able to do what we do without the exquisite communication systems that we have today.
Yeah, what's the training scheme? And then we'll go on to the next slide, because I know you want to do that.
Yes, sir. A little bit. One of the things that I have been really heavily focused on since I took this position last summer, is we're sort of looking at the continuum of education and training for our judge advocates in the operations and international law portfolio. And it really is going to feel like deja vu to you, sir, but we are looking at, our ops law courses. What is it really that we need to teach in the basic ops law course? But more importantly, what do we need to teach in the basic JAG Corps course, the first course that our lieutenants, brand new lieutenants, go into when they come into the Air Force and become judge advocates? There is a baseline of operations and international law that they are going to need, regardless of whether they decide to specialize in this area, or if they just end up at pick a base, United States or overseas. There are some fundamental basic things that every judge advocate needs to know. And so we're doing a scrub from JSOC all the way up to our advanced courses to make sure that we are revisiting what we are doing so that our folks have what they need, quite frankly, earlier than what we had done in the past. And so for an example, we're looking at how soon do we really need to do the Geneva Conventions type stuff. We've seen some things happen where some fairly junior folks missed some very basic things, like, what to do if we have prisoners, and what the requirements are for how to take care of them. And obviously, sir, that you can't just turn them loose with a pack of cigarettes and a few dollars. There are some laws that say we have to do more. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but something similar has kind of happened in the past, and that sort of opened our eyes that we need to do a better job earlier in training our judge advocates in these areas of operations and international law.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, even though it's the Air Force, you're going to be on the ground in different locations and have to be prepared for, all different kinds of legal contingencies.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And it certainly has caused us to change our calculus on what needs to be taught when in an airman's career. And we're definitely pushing that stuff earlier and putting more emphasis on it because how the world has changed, quite frankly. And so we're going to have to change with it if we want to maintain our strategic advantages. Okay, next slide. All right, let's move on to space. There can certainly be no question on the importance that space plays, not just in our everyday life for all of us, but also for military operations and maneuver. We rely on space every day, every minute, and this is a vulnerability that a potential adversary can certainly exploit.
One of the things you may be interested in is one of the things I found since I retired is so many people do not realize that their phone and their car navigation system is all dependent on satellites that the Air Force operates.
Yes, sir. And that's one of the things that, I was going to point out on this slide, for there are civilian uses, some of it public safety even, weather alerts, emergency response, humanitarian aid, communications, your cell phone, your internet, navigation, your GPS, banking, our financial institutions, ATMs, your transactions, control systems, even for electricity, energy and water, transportation. So much of that relies on those satellites that we have up there. Yes, sir.
One of the things is kind of in the discussion realm, especially given the recent conflict, and Russia has a lot of capability in space. And do you have folks looking at the issue of targeting satellites? Because one of the challenges is that we deal with academia is they're dual use systems, and trying to anticipate in fact, somebody asked me this question, how do you calculate the potential civilian harm when it's a GPS satellite that anybody could use before you would, and of course our adversaries have their own systems, before you would be able to do that? Do you have folks trying to unpack those kinds of issues?
Yes, sir. And funny you mentioned that. It's one of the reasons why we started down this road of having a separate service. As you think about those threats in space, the increasing threats in space, and our reliance on it in a national security way, and the potential adversaries who are developing those capabilities and weapons, that can destroy or interfere with our satellites, as well as, sir, orbital debris and congestion. Those things are also quite dangerous to how we do our business of national security. I will say that we do have some folks working on some working groups and with the Department of Defense and other agencies on responsible behaviors in space. I know that we have another speaker that's going to talk some more about space law that, quite frankly, is somewhat of the Wild Wild West. It's getting better, but there are some international laws, some norms that we are moving to establish to address those. I can tell you that, the United States Space Force, one of the reasons that we stood it up is because the space assets were essentially sort of spread out across the services as we're thinking about a national security context. And so, the services weren't necessarily prioritizing space. And that was part of the impetus behind having that separate service. And now the Space Force, United States Space Force, now in its second year, has its own budget, advocates for its own interests before Congress and other agencies. I can tell you that they are razor focused on rapid acquisition and development of space assets. We are focused, we are right there with them on responsible behaviors in space. I have a team of space law attorneys, as you saw that slide with Colonel Jen Heiser, and a team of folks who get to go off to places like McGill and Nebraska to do their LLM in space law, and then they get to come either here or go to one of our Space Force field commands.
General Crawford has frozen up on us there, and let me just say that I'm hoping that we are able to, here at Duke Law School, to open up our LLM program so that we can have some of these Air Force and other services people here.
One of the questions that comes up is, about, what is space law, and and it's essentially international law, right? In the context of the Space Force, it really is international law that functions the same way in that domain as it functions in other domains. We rely on treaties, customary international law. There is an outer space treaty and additional treaties that help shape international law in space. And for our part, we review those space operations in the context of international law to ensure that we comply with those treaties. I think you'll probably hear something about the Woomera Manual and the Millamos. Just for situational awareness, the Air Force, we contribute to both. We're agnostic. Those manuals, the Woomera Manual is not itself international law, but we do provide some assistance in the drafting of that, and so I just wanted to put that out there. We're not choosing.
Yeah, Professor Laurie Blank's going to talk about that, but
yes,
I still haven't figured out how come there are these two separate efforts going forward, and I think you have the right words there. If I were sitting in your shoes, that you'd be agnostic about them, and you contribute to both, and I'll sort that out more when Professor Blank is
yes, sir.
speaking.
One other thing I want to touch on for the audience with regard to space. I know you probably hear about the United States Space Force, and then you hear about United States Space Command. And I just want to clean that up so that it's clear. The United States Space Force is another service, like the Air Force, like the Army, like the Navy. And so they are a separate force that is charged with organizing, training, and equipping, for you Goldwater Nichols types out there, the services so that they can be ready to produce or present forces for our combatant commanders. Now, the U.S. Space Command is a geographic combatant command whose theater operations is space. And so that's the difference. We have what we call the COCOM, combatant command for the theater of space. And the Space Force is the service that presents the preponderance of the forces for the U.S. Space Command, and certainly can take questions when we're wrapping up here quite soon on that, if you have questions on that. But if it's okay with you, sir, I'd like to move to cyber.
Sure. And in fact, one of the questions from one of my students, Cameron Burns, is, and you may be addressing it here, is what is the most challenging aspect of cyber that you're dealing with in the Air Force?
I wish I could say that I could pick one. There are international and domestic issues that are unique to cyberspace. I will tell you that, for the international issues, the nature of cyberspace can affect different states, which have various domestic laws governing their use. This particular aspect of cyberspace, interagency coordination is critical to ensure we have appropriate coordination with a lot of agencies who have equities in all types of operations. I will tell you that it's probably no surprise that artificial intelligence and autonomous systems are critical enablers for how our future force is going to execute. And so we're working on ways for the Air Force to leverage that AI and create that human and machine teaming. I know folks get a little worried when we start talking about fully autonomous. We are talking about human and machine teaming, which enables our airmen, quite frankly, to process massive amounts of data more rapidly to assist our human decision makers. For example, even arriving at targeting decisions.
Yeah, I think that out here in academia, there's, a lot of discussion about humans in the loop and so forth. But, and tell me if I have this wrong, it seems to me that most AI right now and for the foreseeable future is more in the realm of decision support as opposed to making the decision itself.
Yes, sir, that is exactly right. It is support to the human decision maker. Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
There's one blurb, and can you go to the next slide, please, Amanda? Yeah, so here's my fancy cyber slide to talk about some of those issues that we're facing. I want to talk a little bit about wearable technology. That is certainly presenting some challenges for us that we'll have to work through going forward. One of the questions we're looking at is when does collection of vital signs go, cross over into biometric data collection? In other words, when have we gone beyond, getting a better resting heart rate to being able to recognize an individual based on sort of measurable anatomical, physiological, or behavioral characteristics? We are looking at the law and policy and looking at protections for PII, these issues of personally identifiable information. Certainly some HIPAA issues are raised, Privacy Act considerations, like how we establish a system of records if we're collecting information. And even like, what about the criminal context? Are we creating Fifth Amendment issues? Or, in the services Article 31 issues, can we use data that's being collected by these devices in court? You've probably heard some issues about wearable tech, maybe potentially compromising possible military operation locations. And so those are some of the issues that we are definitely facing in the cyberspace.
I'm kind of wondering if you go into a skiff these days, do you have to take your watch off?
Unless it's analog, sir. Yes, sir. So yeah, in the skiff, we're having to disarm with our tech and put that stuff in lockers, and not just in the skiff. In fact, all the buildings in the Pentagon, we are no longer allowed to bring any of this wearable tech into our spaces because of the classified capability of the spaces where we work. And
well, unfortunately, we're running down on our time here, and I did want to ask you just a couple things about what leadership or what do you, as a senior JAG leader, what do you look for in young judge advocates? And do you have any recommendations or thoughts for law students who might be considering public service writ large in the military in specific?
That's a great question, sir. And Amanda, if I could get you to go to slide 14, I think that I want to have that up while I talk to that. I've been fortunate enough to have some amazing mentors who've taught me some great things about how to be my best self, and some of the things that they looked for, I also look for. I think number one is probably that thirst for knowledge, that pursuit of wanting to be your best self, to pursue excellence and be the best that you can be, regardless of what your job is. My parents taught me that if you're a broom sweeper, your goal in life should be to be the best broom sweeper you can be. And so number one, I certainly look for that effort and that pursuit of excellence to be the best that you can be. And so with that kind of comes some hard work, right? You got to be willing to put the hours in, as General Dunlap would say, mastering your craft. Number three, I would say, there's no substitute for a great attitude. Um, I have been in some situations where the work was hard or the work was easy. The challenges we faced were immense or they were not. And the one thing that I will tell you that I always wanted to make sure I saw in my young folks that was most helpful is if they have a great attitude about it. If you look at having sort of a growth mindset, I don't know how to do this yet, but I will learn how to do it. I think that that growth mindset, that great attitude, is important. And finally, folks that have gone to law school already, we know you're smart, right? And so I think humility, being able to have a conversation with another human being and relate to them on a human level is going to be something that gets us a lot further. You can be a straight A student, you can be the best at what you in your area of your practice of law, but what I want to know is, can I turn you loose on a commander, right? Well, will I turn you loose to advise a client? And so those are just sort of some leadership thoughts. I do want to take a moment to make a shameless plug for our way of life. The Air Force JAG Corps has some great opportunities to serve our nation and be a part of something that's bigger than yourself. Join a proud institution, see the world. Great benefits. We're always hiring. The wonderful women on this slide here, these two airmen, primarily run the recruiting program. They'd be super excited to hear from you, and as would I. And so thank you so much, General Dunlap, for having me here. It's always a pleasure to see you, sir.
Well, thank you, Gail. And
yes, sir.
I do want you to know that Major Campbell wrote a wonderful blog post for us about her journey. She went to Villanova. I would suggest there might have been a few years between my Villanova class and hers.
Just a couple.
But we're sending 3 super great young law students to be interns. They were selected, and we celebrated them in one of our blog posts. So
yes, sir, outstanding.
And also, I should say, another is going to the Navy to do an internship, and she's a terrific young woman as well.
It's not too late.
Well, thank you so much. I know how busy you are, and we did want to have you down here, but things conspired. Maybe next year you could come, because I know how engaging you are in person, and our students, and I think I speak for folks zooming in from around the world. We do want that personal in-person engagement. But you've shared with us. I've learned a few things, and I'm embarrassed to tell you that whole Space Command, Space Force thing I had it wrong if you would quiz me. But so great to see you. Thank you so much, and looking forward to seeing you in person.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Out here.
Out here.
Thank you.